of those who served. I'm Council Lady Paula Stennett, and today we're going to meet a wonderful gentleman who has an extremely active career with the United States Air Force. It is my honor to introduce to you Mr. Tom Elmendorf.
Happy to know you.
And you, sir. This has been so exciting meeting you and looking at your career and the expansive time and all of the things that occurred in United States history during your career. 17 years old, and this is 1947. You are not a passenger in an airplane, you are the pilot of an airplane at 17. How did this come about?
Well, I've always wanted to fly, and I got to Texas A&M, and the opportunity was right there. A little field going 5 miles away. And my dad said, if you're going to fly, I'm going to get an insurance policy on your life. Guess how much?
How much?
$5,000.
$5,000.
Today that would be $50,000.
Well, I was going to say, $5,000 at that time,
Yeah.
inflation.
But anyway, that's what happened.
So at 17, you pilot your first plane, but you told me you knew that that's what you wanted to do since you were about 5. You were fascinated with air flight.
Probably had maybe 20 airplanes hanging off my ceilings, little models.
Yeah, such as the ones before us that you brought today.
Yeah.
So 17, you knew that you wanted a career in flying.
Yeah.
6 years later, you join, at the age of 23, the Air Force and begin a lifelong career of service. That move must have been difficult to make. World War II, things going on, unsettling, and you decide you're going to join. And it's right after II finishes, but there's some things still heated up. Joseph Stalin, our President Truman, a lot of distrust, a lot of arms race, a lot of communists behind every bush, and you still join.
I hate to say this, but it was join that or get drafted.
And you knew the direction you wanted to go.
Absolutely.
And what an illustrious career it turned out to be. So there you are, 1950, 23 years old. You've actually been in service 2 years, 1952, and you receive an assignment.
Yeah. First assignment when I got my pilot wings was Air Defense Command, and I was in the Air Defense Command basically my whole career.
Okay. Air Defense Command. What was Air Defense Command? What was your job?
Well, we sat alert 24/7, and we were sitting on the ground waiting for the bell to go off, and we leaped into the air to see who was up there. And that was the mission, with wondering if the Russians were coming in or not coming. And actually, we found a lot of commercial airlines just off course.
Well, you kept those commercial airlines going back on course,
Yeah.
straightened them out, and you 24/7, 365. You guys were there, you were ready, you were in the air, you were the first responders to what all Americans feared. USSR, the Russians, Stalin sending planes our way. Were there any times when it wasn't a commercial airline?
Actually, it wasn't a commercial airline. It was some of our Navy pilots back, again, when I was up in Iceland. They were coming through low and on the water at the nighttime. That was kind of hairy, but you have to fly in on them until you can ID them. And then it was okay, and we left.
So at this time in history, there's no other way to identify another aircraft other than actually being close enough to see them.
That's true. Yes, that's true.
So the pilots who were in charge of doing this, taking a fighter plane, a jet fighter plane, close enough to another aircraft to visually identify, those weren't the pilots who just barely got out of flight school.
No. But you had a radar guy in the back seat, and once the land radar turned us over onto this unknown, then my radar guy in the back seat would pick him up, and that's when we would start bringing in closer and closer and closer. So finally, through the clouds and whatever, the dark of night, there would come the unknown. And that's the way it worked.
That's impressive because you flew with some of the World War II aces and some of the Korean aces from the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys were highly trained, and you took off, I read, you would take off 0 degrees in an instant.
I held a record one time, I think it was less than a minute. We were upstairs asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, and by the time you get your boots on downstairs, we would start the airplane, get off, and get airborne in less than a minute. It was great. It was a record at one point.
And you think about how fast did aircraft travel at that time?
Well, I've been through the speed of sound in an airplane. I wasn't supposed to be through the speed of sound, but we were going just under the speed of sound.
And that's how fast you and the rest of the gentlemen with whom you served flew to be out there if anyone was approaching our soil.
Yeah.
The first line of defense.
Yeah.
Now, being 24/7, you and the guys, sometimes there wasn't a lot to do there when you were out, and you would do your patrols, and every now and again, you want to have a little fun maybe.
That's true. That's true.
Test your courage, test your skills. And what happened during one of those opportunities?
Got scrambled about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I found it was okay, it was a good airplane. And we just flying around. I thought I'd drop down a little bit, San Francisco area, come down below the level of the Golden Gate Bridge, which is real pretty down there.
I'm sure.
And then I popped it straight up and kicked the afterburner in. And the afterburner, for people that maybe don't know, it goes out maybe 20 feet behind the airplane, big ball of flame, makes an awful big noise. And it's real interesting because the next morning they woke up the whole area around San Francisco, went down 20 or 30 miles, the sound carried down there. They considered it to be Army howitzers going off. The Army was down there too, so that was kind of fun, yeah.
So people thought they were under attack all of a sudden.
They didn't know what it was. It was that or an earthquake. They didn't know.
Well, they didn't take your wings.
No.
You kept flying. And you became sort of, in this book, the first line, that part of your flying experience was really acknowledged. It was a comedy, but it's sort of a hero being able to fly like that.
Yeah. More so up in Iceland, but yes, you're correct.
Well, fun things are happening, but also the very serious things. Because the Cold War, and I shared with you earlier, I spoke to my students, the Cold War, and they sort of looked at me like, well, did everyone wear heavy jackets during that time? They really didn't know what the Cold War was. And President Truman at that time, after World War II is over, he says we need to practice a strategy called containment. And it wasn't until George Orwell wrote his essay, You and the Atomic Bomb, and he coined the term the Cold War, that term actually began being used. And the Cold War lasted 40 years.
Yeah.
And was prompted a lot of newfound diplomacy, a lot of newfound technology, newly developing an era, several eras, changing the entire world.
Yeah, well, we surrounded the United States, so to speak, with the Air Force would be here, 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 and here, like that, as an arc around it. And we were in Iceland the same way. So that was the first line. I don't know how good we would have been because I had four little 50 caliber machine guns in my airplane. That wasn't much boom. Later, we had an airplane that where if I saw something, I could snap straight up and shoot, and that would be an atomic weapon. And as soon as I shot, I went like that, and we never had to use it. Thankfully, I never had to use those.
So you had atomic weapons actually on your plane?
This is after I came back from Iceland. Yeah, we were in the F-89, and that was the first airplane that was equipped like that.
And you were flying. So your flying finesse, if you will, kept everyone safe, but also that you didn't go down. Because if you were to go down with that type of weaponry, what could have occurred?
Not good.
Not good.
Not good, no.
So the pilots who were trusted with that weaponry were the upper echelon pilots
Yeah.
for protection.
Yeah.
So it's 1947, Truman has addressed Congress, and he wants to support the free people who are resisting communism. We want to contain communism. The arms race begins in 1949, and the Soviets actually are the first ones. They test an atom bomb.
Mhm.
That was a wake-up call.
You bet. You bet. Now, remember, that's just before my time. So I'm not flying yet. I'm thinking, but I'm not flying.
Not flying yet, but then when you come back, the United States builds this destructive atomic weapon, the hydrogen bomb or super bomb, and then Stalin follows suit with that one and its own, to the point that technology advances so much by the time you are flying, after the machine gun in the plane era, you have atomic weaponry on a plane.
Yeah. Early 50s on up through, every one of them progressed to a much better airplane. And then we got much better equipment, much better armament, and we could have done a good job had we had to attack somebody.
Ready. But your education in these new weapons, these new systems, these new developed high technology planes, your education had to be continuous to stay up with this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it did, but remember, my education really had to be only be a pilot and how to track it and how to shoot at somebody. The guys that put all that together are the heroes.
Well, but you are a hero as well, because in the 1950s and 1960s, and I was in school in the 60s, we were doing drills. The schools, we were getting under our desk. We were preparing just in case something happened and your line of defense failed. Thank you for making those drills unnecessary, because you never failed.
Yeah, that's right.
Kept us safe. 1957, Cold War is extending and space exploration is going. The Russians put Sputnik in the air in October '57. It's a satellite that's going around. And there's a big scare that occurs in the hearts of every American because of that satellite.
Well, it didn't make any difference to us, because in our job at that time, by the way, I was out of the front line of the fighters, and I was in what's called a military advisory group with the Thai Air Force. But everybody felt it. I just wasn't flying airplanes the same way I was before. I had no gun in my hand.
Yeah. But something else happened a year earlier. In 1956,
Oh yeah, I got tired, didn't I?
you did. You changed your status. You got married. Love of your life.
Yes, ma'am.
Tell me about it.
Well, I went down to fire, again, all reflects with the Air Force. We went down to Moody Air Force Base to fire rockets, and I met a rocket. That's where she was. Yeah.
That's where she was.
From that point, I was in Prescott, Maine. I flew back and forth, and my CO was a nice guy. And maybe at 10 o'clock at night, we'd say, "Look, well, you want to go down to Valdosta, Georgia?" And I said, "Sure." He'd go down and roll the hangar doors open. I'd jump in the airplane, go down and see her. And that was the day when we had a lot of money and no problem. You know, they didn't care. But that's what happened to her. It involved back and forth, and then we got married. April.
So a long-term long time commute,
Yeah.
going back and forth, and dating the love of your life. And that marriage produces
3 little guys,
3 little guys,
all of them over 6 feet and over 200 pounds.
big guys.
One of them which married the lady who happened to be in the audience as well.
A very special lady, Miss Betty is
Yes.
at that. So beautiful marriage, beautiful children, beautiful time in your life. But things in the world aren't quite as easygoing and tranquil as that relationship that you have. Your position with the Air Force has changed. And now you're still studying, you're still staying up with the changes in the United States. And you begin working with others. Instead of you just practicing your education, you're educating other people.
Yep, I basically, I kept with the command center. If I wasn't flying an airplane, I'd be in a command center someplace. And when I got overseas, normally I would be with the Thai Air Force, and that was interesting. That was a lot of fun. I have to, you're very serious, which is very proper, but I found the Air Force as fun. One every day of my life was fun. So I was happy to be there.
Well, you know, they say, if you enjoy what you do, you don't work a day in your life.
Absolutely.
And obviously, you enjoyed the Air Force. You enjoyed the United States and the duty that you performed.
Yeah.
The world changes again. 1 year, in '58, the U.S. launches Explorer, its own satellite. The space race is on. Not only do we enter space, but aircraft and changes with the protection devices, our defense mechanism. And then Ike, President Dwight Eisenhower is in office. NASA is born. Space race is beginning. What changes do you perform then, being in the Air Force?
Actually, I'm sorry to say nothing. Everything was the same for me. I haven't reached the upper strata of the management end of it, so I just did my job and waited for anything to happen. I would be ready, that's all.
We're ready, always on guard, always ready. And that's important because you got married in '56, and then in '69, Neil Armstrong, Apollo 11, he walks on the moon. You're raising a young family.
Let me tell you what happened then. In about a split second, this bride of mine, he walked on the moon, and she falls down, breaks her ankle or something. She broke her ankle, arm, that's what it was. So that I can remember that about what happened to her. But,
Oh, no. Well, that's an unfortunate way to be able to remember it.
yeah.
And you have 3 boys.
Uh-huh.
Do they want to follow in your footsteps, or do they want to be astronauts? Astronauts became heroes. Children wanted to go to space. They wanted to know the moon was not made of cheese.
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to think about that. Trey almost got in the Air Force. That was his almost. My next son never had got to the age where he would have gone, and my third son, he didn't breathe Army or Air Force. So that's kind of the way my kids went.
Okay. The State Department. We have Senator Joseph McCarthy. There is a communist behind every tree. You're wearing the uniform. How did that go with being a man who has dedicated his life, and all of a sudden people are seeing a communist everywhere?
You know, the only thing I got out of that was ridiculous, but we came back from overseas, and of course all the kids had changed. Now they're here, down here, but the military people, when they came back and went to the Pentagon, we didn't wear our uniforms. Yeah, they said, I don't know why that ever came to pass, but we used to always go to work in uniforms, and now we're back in civilian clothes. And some of the times overseas, again, they didn't want us in uniforms. So I guess they were afraid that some of it would pop us, I don't know. Although we didn't have all the scare that they have today. But that's kind of the way the thing was trending.
Okay, so they actually told you not to wear your uniform to protect you as a member of the armed forces.
Yeah, I think so. That's the big part of it, yes.
Wow, and I was unaware, this is the first I've heard of that occurrence.
Mhm. Well, maybe that was in the Pentagon now. Right? In other words, out in the bases, they still had uniforms and flying suits and whatever. But we're talking about now when I come back to the Pentagon, that's the way the situation was, yeah.
So you're in the Pentagon now. Magnificent building, 5 sides. I've always wondered if that represents 5 branches of service.
No, it doesn't, but it represents a puzzle because you have to figure out how to get from point A to point B. And it took a while, really.
I'm sure my aunt retired from working in the Pentagon, and she said it was an unbelievable maze.
Right.
McCarthyism is over. We've been through Korean War. We've hit that. We've hit Nam. And life in the United States is stressed. Your service, you're in the Pentagon. What has changed with these developments?
Different wars, different that, and this, because I'm now sitting behind the desk monitoring the wars in Vietnam, basically. And it seems like every time something happens, well, we're popping up and we're fighting again. And that's what I was doing personally.
So there wasn't really a breather, hardly, between these wars that occur, and during these times, the Cold War is still ensuing. We still are practicing containment. We still are making sure the arms race, that we are staying ahead of the Soviets. And developments are still occurring, which are giving you different technologies to utilize as well.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, somewhere in there now we got tear down that wall came and then things started changing like that.
Definitely. In the 60s, President Kennedy is there, and JFK, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, then Nam. The United States has been committed to an anti-communist government since the 60s and the containment. And we start this military action to try to hold at bay North Vietnam.
I'm missing you right in that one step because I'm not involved in that. Where am I? What date is this now?
This is 61. As Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile,
Yeah.
and then Vietnam occurs.
Yeah, I'm overseas and I'm just doing work with other nations. Yeah.
So you're in a diplomacy with other nations now.
Mm-hmm.
So meeting with leaders of other nations or military people in other nations, keeping that diplomacy alive throughout the world, really, so that we are not isolated during any battles.
Yeah, I have to say though, at that time, certainly if I'm in Thailand, I'm not in that diplomacy. I'm in the level down with the Thai squadrons, and I was also the only one that can take dependents in the airplane, for some reason or other, because of my background. And so I had a real tough job. But the guys the dependents wanted to go to Singapore for a weekend. Guess who had to take them? I mean, that was that kind of stuff. So my job was a little bit different.
Well, and Nixon comes in, and he says, let's use diplomacy instead of military action. So you're right there. You're doing the diplomacy effort. You and your family are having to live away from home, and you're practicing, you're part of the diplomacy throughout the world. And keeping Thailand and that area, which right next to Vietnam,
Sure.
keeping them friendly with us. So keeping that diplomacy alive, saving a lot of American lives.
Sure, that's right.
Okay?
Mr. Nixon came to visit us in Thailand, and I had the pleasure of making him stop because I was in the wrong spot. And I said, "Excuse me, sir," and then Mr. Nixon passed. Yes, fun.
Well, and then we have the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, SALT I. And then Reagan comes, and the Cold War heats up again.
Mhm.
The Reagan Doctrine, and then Reagan makes a famous speech in Brandenburg Gate. He's in Berlin, and he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And by 1991,
Yep.
parts of the wall are down and being sold.
Mhm.
And you've seen it all.
Yeah, but again, I hate to downplay my problem, I had nothing to do with it. Mr. Reagan never asked me, how to do it.
Well, he never asked you, but he knew you had his back
Yeah, had
and
his back.
keeping diplomacy alive
Yeah.
and saving American lives through strength and dedication. Tom, historically, the squadron that you served with, tell me about their history.
History of the squadron was, they were the old Flying Tigers. They flew fighter airplanes in the war over in China, real tough business, and they were finally disbanded after that fighting was over. The squadron came to the United States, and we were that squadron at that point. So it was kind of a proud deal. We were flying in the Flying Tiger Squadron. Yeah.
Flying Tiger Squadron. I've heard the Flying Tiger Squadron. Very impressive, elite aces.
Yeah. If you get a picture of the airplane right in the front, it's painted like a big jaw there. I'm getting you.
So the tiger in the air,
Yeah.
the air tiger.
That's it.
Are there any pilots you remember who you can recall and tell us about?
Well, back in the war in China, I mean, we're going way back, but one of my very close friends, he came from that mission, and he became he was an extremely good pilot, and I was the only one he really liked to fly with, though, that we would rat race all over the place. And that's the one I remember. His name was Craig, and wouldn't it be interesting that my second son was named Craig?
Quite an honor.
Yeah.
Quite an honor. We've talked about history, we've talked about the Air Force, we've talked about your career in service, 20 years.
20 years, 2 months, and 20 days. Who cares?
20 years, 2 months, and 20 days. Not that we're counting.
That's right.
And keeping diplomacy alive. But you really didn't stop serving when you left the Air Force, did you?
Well, I got to think about that one. No, I didn't stop serving, but I stopped my immediate Air Force affiliation, yes. So I don't know where you're going with that one, because I was always for the United States, backing them up.
Well, this is true. But you did other things to help in the communities in the States after your retirement.
My business at that point was in the sports arena, as my children were growing up, and then I had my hiccup a little bit there, but all the time with sports. And how many families would be involved there? A whole bunch. Yeah.
Exactly. So you're still conducting yourself and being a hero to children through sports. They're seeing you continue serving and continue working with families and kids, and not just going through the motions and wearing a uniform. You're continuing to put on another uniform, that ball cap,
Yeah. Yeah.
coaching.
Nothing that nobody else will do. So I can't be jumping up and down saying, "Whoopee, look at me."
Yeah, but a lot of people would not do, and a lot of people don't take that time to continue serving and giving and doing things with kids, but you did. You continued your lifelong working with children.
Just like the Air Force, it was fun.
It was fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not working a day in your life still.
That's right.
Still serving and helping, but with kids.
I can only say this, and very, very truthfully, I would have paid Uncle Sam to let me do what I did. And he kept paying me all of that every month,
Well, and how wonderful it is, those retirement checks. That's my ultimate job, when I
Yes.
get to that retirement check.
That is correct.
Now, working to protect the United States, diplomacy, working with children, athletics, and we all know that kids who practice athletics and stay keeps them from getting into other trouble. So you're still being diplomatic and still helping, and children dear to your heart, because I see the way you look at that granddaughter.
Yes, yes, yes. You hit the button on knowing where my kids are all the time.
All the
Because I can
time.
know the sports and what the arena, and all of them were very successful. So I was very, very happy about that.
So being an active parent is definitely a key to your children being successful and productive citizens.
It was in the golf arena, which is my bag. I watched them grow through what my skill level, and then on way beyond me and being champions on the golf course. And they said that they got it from me, but I say phooey. They were good.
You're always too humble, Tom, always too humble. But knowing how much you love family and children, I want to ask you one final question. What do you want the children today to know from you? What lesson do you want them to learn?
Well, lessons from me, that's it. That's not too tough because I've always looked for the future of our country, and having the opportunity to, what I did in the Air Force was a privilege, 100%. And if they have the opportunity to serve, don't like that, man, do it. And the youngsters, some of which are a little troubled, you get in the military. You get yourself square, straight and away. Just look for what our country's all about. That's all I can say.
That's awesome, Tom. Thank you so much for spending time with me today and sharing with our audience some of the little known facts, wonderful opportunities, and the history of the United States.
Well, you're pretty good on that history of the United States. That's great. Now, thank you very much for having me.
And this concludes this episode of Those Who Serve. Thanks to Tom Elmendorf, retired Lieutenant Colonel from the Air Force, sharing his part in history and the importance of serving. It's a privilege and an honor to serve you. I'm Council Lady Paula Stinnett. God bless America, and as always, it's a great day to be in Fort Oglethorpe.